France, September 1944. Night lay over the shattered villages like a blackout curtain, and the only lights allowed to move were painted onto steel. 2 thin cat-eye slits on each fender. A dim hooded glow along a river of trucks that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The air smelled of wet earth and warm engines, of diesel and rope and canvas that had absorbed rain for a month. Somewhere a church bell with no clapper rattled in the wind. Somewhere a dog barked once and gave up. And through it all came the sound that did not stop. The synchronized coffin settle of thousands of idling motors waiting for a gloved hand to close or open, stop or go. Unteroffizier Erich Hartmann, not the ace from the posters, just a weary logistics clerk in a gray greatcoat, stood in the doorway of a requisitioned barn and tried to count what would not be counted. He had been told, like every German soldier, that the Americans were soft, that they hid behind machines because they lacked courage, that they could not fight at night without flares and moonlight. He had been told that your enemy's weakness was your weapon, but out on the road that cut past the hedgerow like a vein, weakness did not sound like this. Weakness did not hum. Weakness did not cue. An MP with a white bar on his helmet stepped into the beam of a shuttered lantern, raised his arm, and the line began to move. The first truck took the curve low and steady, its gears catching, the canvas sides bowing in the damp wind. Painted on the hood were pale, stenciled letters that read, U.S. Army 2.5 ton. He had watched tanks before, felt the ground thump beneath panzers like a pulse out of rhythm. This was different. This was a heartbeat you could steady a nation to. Truck after truck, axle after axle, the same short shift before the rise, the same cough of exhaust turning to breath, the same wide tires flattening mud into a road that had not been there the day before. The men inside were silhouettes, caps pulled low, sleeves rolled, hands at 10 and 2 like schoolboys who had learned a single lesson too well to forget. When they passed the barn, he could see coffee steam lifting from an enamel cup wedged between a ledger and a grease pencil on the dashboard. Coffee at midnight in a rain that made thoughts heavy. One driver tapped the rim twice, an old habit or a superstition, then glanced toward the MP's pale glove and obeyed without hurry. It was the lack of drama that unnerved him most. No shouting, no horns, just a column that flowed the way a river flows when it knows its bed. Eric had a list in his pocket. Tonnage captured at a yard outside Chartres. Barrels of fuel that should have reached an armored regiment and did not, spares that existed only as numbers now. And he felt that paper shrink in importance with every truck that passed. He had argued weeks ago that the enemy's advantage lay in machines. Deny them fuel and rubber and this advantage collapses like a bridge burned behind you. But he had not imagined the Americans would build a moving bridge and then drive their own war across it. He had not imagined a highway without pavement, a schedule without a clock, a plan that sounded like traffic instead of orders. A wind came down the lane and lifted the edge of his coat. He stepped out beneath the hedgerow, boots sinking in ruts stamped by another country's urgency, and tried to taste what the air carried. Gasoline, yes. Hot metal, yes. But something else rode the night, something harder to name. Confidence cut into smell and motion. Confidence in cat-eye paint and blackout discipline. In tire pressure and axle grease, in the simple doctrine that if you keep moving, you win. He remembered a briefing in a schoolroom outside Metz where a major with chalk on his sleeve had smacked the board and sworn that the Americans believed war could be solved like an inventory. They count, the major had said with a bitter smile. They count and count and count until nothing is left that cannot be moved. The class had laughed because it sounded like a joke. Counting is what clerks do, not armies. But out on the road, counting made a sound. It sounded like second gear catching, like a downshift before a hill, like brakes whispered instead of slammed, like an engine warmed long enough that it would not fail at the crest. Somewhere up the line, a whistle blew once. A break in the column, a tree down, a narrow bridge taking only one direction at a time, the sort of thing that in his army became panic. Here it became patience. Trucks idled. A corporal walked the shoulder with a flashlight held low to spare eyes, touching fenders as if counting beads on a rosary made of steel. Men waited with sleeves steaming, cups pressed to lips, the smell of burned coffee and wet wool hanging under the hedges. Then the glove lifted and the line exhaled, and the road found its old rhythm, the way a machine finds it after you clear grit from a gear. Eric did not realize he had spoken aloud until the corporal beside him, an American with rain crawling off the brim of his helmet, turned his head. What did you say? Eric shut his mouth. He had not meant to say anything. But the truth had slipped out in a language the Rhine understood. It does not stop, he said in German. It does not stop. The corporal did not understand the words, only the tone. He looked out at the road where cat eyes came and went, and shrugged like a man agreeing with the weather. No, buddy, he said softly as if to himself. It don't. A truck passed with the canvas flap lifted by wind, and for a heartbeat Eric saw the cargo. Not bombs or rifles, not something that could be pointed or fired, but stacked wooden crates, stenciled rations, and 50 cal and medical, as if war itself were being boxed into needs. Behind that came drums with diamond markings for fuel, then pallets sheeted in tarred cloth that must have been tires. He imagined a map where the front line was not a jagged black pencil, but a ledger line moving forward because the numbers behind it wouldn't sit still. He had been told to believe that courage was a finite thing, that you spent it in charges and earned it with blood. Out here, a new equation wrote itself in the dark. Courage could also be measured in miles driven without headlights, in hours without sleep, in hands that learned a road by feel and chose not to stop because someone else was waiting at the far end with an empty tank. He thought of the phrase the major had spit like a joke, "They count," and felt a thin, unfamiliar fear. What if counting was not cowardice? What if it was the most dangerous kind of bravery, the kind that arrives on time? The barn smelled of hay and old iron. The night smelled of the future. When the last truck of that segment passed, an MP flipped a sign, and the oncoming lane began to pour too, a second river fed by the first. Eric slid the useless list back into his pocket and watched a nation move like a machine that had found its purpose. The rain thickened. A driver downshifted at the hill and did not stall. Somewhere very far away, someone who would never see this road drew an arrow on a map and believed it would reach the end of the page. Eric understood then, not with rage but with a tired clarity that made his bones heavy. The Führer had laughed at trucks. Tonight the laughter sounded small. The road did not, it sang. Dawn crept across the hedgerows like a tired blessing. The rain had eased, leaving ruts silver with puddles and the smell of hot metal already in the air. By the time the church bell in the next village rang once, the first convoy was 30 miles east, still rolling. Eric followed on foot with a liaison detail sent to survey abandoned depots. What he saw along the way unsettled him more than battle ever had. Every crossroad was choreographed. American MPs in white belts stood like metronomes, swinging flashlights in silent rhythm. Supply trucks slowed but never stopped. Beside each checkpoint, engineers had thrown up signboards painted with arrows and code names. Red Ball, Chartres, Rennes, Front. The words meant nothing to him except certainty. They were turning France itself into an assembly line. A corporal in his group muttered, "They move as if the war is a delivery schedule." Eric said nothing. He was counting. Trucks per minute, drums per truck, miles per hour. The numbers multiplied like cells dividing. One convoy every 7 minutes, 12 tons each, 80 miles in a shift, 6,000 trucks, perhaps more. And each gallon delivered meant another mile of armor, another city taken. It wasn't bravery he saw. It was geometry. He remembered how the Reich measured distance, in blood, in men lost to mud and cold. The Americans measured it in ton miles. They had turned suffering into arithmetic. At a crossroads near Le Mans they stopped while a breakdown team replaced an axle in less than 10 minutes. No shouting, no panic. A spare rolled off a maintenance truck. A wrench flashed once and the crippled vehicle rejoined the column as if nothing had happened. Eric's own motor pool in Normandy would have waited days for a part that never came. He watched the American sergeant wipe his hands on a rag and jot a number into a notebook. Even the repair was counted. By afternoon, the sun had burned away the mist, revealing a sight both ridiculous and terrifying. The road itself seemed alive, trucks nose to tail for miles, canvas gleaming, windshields hooded, their drivers young enough to be schoolboys. On each fender, a white star, repeated until it looked less like a symbol than a brand. The star of a company that believed in efficiency more than hatred. An MP leaned against a post eating from a tin of peaches. He offered one to a passing driver, who caught it without slowing. The can disappeared into the cab window and the column never lost tempo. Eric felt the same unease he'd known when he first saw American bombers. Machines too large, too casual to fear. They fight with time instead of bullets, he thought. and the phrase lodged like a splinter he could not shake. That evening, they bivouacked near an old stone bridge rebuilt with timber and rope. A sign read, "Restricted load 5 tons." Every truck that crossed slowed exactly to speed, weight distributed, plank groaning but never breaking. On the far bank, bulldozers idled, waiting to replace the temporary span with steel by morning. The smell of creosote and gasoline drifted downstream. The Germans had destroyed bridges for months trying to stall this tide. The Americans built new ones faster than maps could mark them. Eric sat by the river eating cold bread from his ration tin. Across the water, a maintenance tent glowed with generator light. Inside, men hunched over charts marked with colored lines. He could not read the English words, but he understood the meaning. This was not improvisation. It was design. When he finally slept, the convoy's sound followed him into dreams. The low, endless rumble of progress made audible. In the dream, he was back in the classroom where the major had mocked American logistics. The chalk squealed as the officer drew a truck on the board, exaggerated and clumsy. Then the drawing began to move, rolling over the map, flattening borders until the blackboard was empty and the major's voice had turned into the hum of engines. He woke before dawn, sweat cold on his neck. Outside, headlights flickered like fireflies down the valley. Another convoy was already on the move. It struck him that the war had become a kind of mathematics lesson, one his country had refused to learn. You could not win against a nation that understood motion as an equation. When his captain asked what he had observed, Eric handed over a notebook filled with columns of figures and only one sentence written beneath them. "They build faster than we destroy." The captain read it twice, frowning, and tore the page out. "Keep your observations technical," he said. "Leave philosophy to the officers." But as Eric watched another river of trucks climb the ridge, he realized it wasn't philosophy at all. It was the sound of inevitability. By October, the convoys had become a second weather. You could tell the day's rhythm not by clouds or wind, but by the pitch of engines on the horizon. In towns that still smelled of rubble and cordite, French children began to wait at crossroads just to watch the trucks go by. They called them les camions de liberté, the trucks of freedom. Sometimes the drivers tossed candy or oranges from open windows. Sometimes they only waved. Either way, the roar of the column left a taste of something sweet behind. Eric Hartmann saw it first from the yard of a captured depot outside Reims. Dozens of German prisoners, mechanics, clerks, men like him, had been put to work stacking crates for the advancing front. They were thin, hollow-eyed, still wearing field gray with the insignia cut off. But their guards were relaxed, almost bored. No shouts, no blows. At midday, a jeep rolled in and an American lieutenant shouted through a megaphone, "Hot chow in 10." The prisoners looked at one another, not sure they'd understood. 10 minutes later, steaming cans of stew were being ladled out from a truck tailgate. Bread followed, then coffee. Not punishment. Provision. Eric sat cross-legged on the gravel, spoon in hand, tasting something that shouldn't have existed for an enemy. The soup was thick with meat, potatoes, carrots. He had eaten worse in victory. Around him, men murmured in disbelief. One of them whispered, "Propaganda." Another shook his head. "No, logistics." He watched an American sergeant supervising the meal. The man kept a clipboard, ticking boxes as if rations and mercy belonged on the same form. To the sergeant, it made perfect sense. Feeding prisoners, feeding civilians, feeding troops, each was a column on a ledger. Efficiency didn't distinguish between friend and foe. The system had swallowed hatred and turned it into procedure. That night, Eric was assigned to help unload a convoy at a field hospital. Canvas tents glowed with generator light, smelling of disinfectant and diesel. Inside, American nurses moved quietly between rows of cots, half Allied, half German. Bandages were white on every arm. A nurse offered him water and pointed to a stack of stretchers that needed cleaning. Her accent was soft, almost musical. "Careful with those, hon. You drop one, you owe me a new floor." He didn't understand the words, but understood the tone. Banter, not contempt. While he scrubbed, he listened. Somewhere a wounded man groaned in English and another voice answered in German. Translation wasn't needed when pain sounded the same. The nurse hummed a tune under her breath, something slow and tender. The melody threaded through the smell of soap and oil, and for the first time since captivity, Eric felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. He thought of his mother's hands, of the bread line in Dresden, of how the world might look if supply and mercy were the same act. When they finished, the sergeant handed him a mug of coffee. "Good work, pal." Eric stared at the dark surface, steam rising in lazy curls. It smelled exactly like the night road, burned fuel and warmth. He took a sip and winced at the bitterness, but the heat spread through him anyway. Around the yard, floodlights caught the shine of fuel drums marked with the white star. Each drum meant a jeep could drive, a plane could land, a generator could keep a wounded man breathing. America's strength wasn't cruelty, it was continuity. Every gallon delivered was a promise kept. Later, lying in his cot, he wrote a note on the back of a discarded invoice. They win because they deliver. He folded the paper and hid it in his boot. If the guards found it, they would laugh, maybe confiscate it as contraband philosophy. But to him, it felt like confession. Days blurred. Convoys came and went, never missing their hour. Engineers built depots overnight. Mess crews served 3 hot meals. Mechanics rotated tires by schedule. It was civilization rehearsing itself. Even the guards began to trust the prisoners with tools again. Eric found himself repairing American trucks, learning their systems. Engines that ran smoother than anything the Reich had built. Filters you could change without dismantling half the machine. He realized design here served the same god as mercy, efficiency. A truck that could be fixed by a tired man at night was a gift of time. And time, he now knew, was America's true weapon. One evening, a convoy rolled in just before curfew, headlights masked, engines idling low. The drivers looked half dead with fatigue. Instead of shouting, the sergeant ordered the prisoners to help unload so the men could rest. They worked side by side, Germans and Americans in the same rhythm, passing crates down the line until the truck stood empty. When it was done, the lieutenant opened a box and handed out chocolate bars ration issue. He didn't check uniforms before offering them. Eric bit into his piece. It melted almost instantly, sweet and foreign, a kind of luxury that felt like forgiveness. He realized then that mercy, when organized, could be more frightening than any weapon. You could resist a bullet. You could not resist generosity measured in tons. As he fell asleep, the sound of engines faded down the highway, an unbroken pulse moving east. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another front waited, and the same trucks would arrive on time again and again, until disbelief itself ran out of fuel. By mid-October 1944, the map of Western Europe no longer meant what it once did. Lines of supply had devoured it. Where rivers once marked frontiers, pontoon bridges now laced them with steel veins. Railways, bombed and broken, were bypassed by the convoys that never slept. The Red Ball Express had become less a road than a bloodstream, carrying fuel, food, and belief through a continent that had forgotten both. Eric saw it from the hill outside Chartres, a silver ribbon of trucks glinting under the noon sun, stretching farther than the eye could measure. He stood beside an American engineer who was sketching the scene on a clipboard. 50 miles today, the man said with a weary pride. By tonight we'll make 80. His pencil kept moving as if to trap motion on paper. Eric realized he was watching an artist of logistics, a man painting with mileage. Everywhere he looked, motion replaced monument. Churches with shattered roofs served as fuel depots. Train stations became command posts. The Americans measured territory not by acres seized but by gallons delivered. They were building a geography of momentum, where rest was treason against progress. Even the rain seemed to cooperate, a thin drizzle that kept dust down but never turned roads to mud. It was as though nature itself had signed the delivery order. One afternoon he helped clear a wreck on the main route near Argentan. A truck had overturned on a bend, spilling jerry cans across the ditch. Within minutes, 2 cranes appeared, cables swung, and the road was open again. The officer in charge didn't shout, he timed. 7 minutes lost, he muttered, writing it down. To Eric, the calm efficiency was terrifying. War treated like factory downtime. In Germany, delays were measured in lives. Here, in minutes. That evening, the convoy halted at a rest stop built from salvaged lumber and tin. Over the gate hung a hand-painted sign. Keep 'em rolling. No excuses. Beneath it, drivers napped in their cabs while mechanics replaced tires by lantern light. The smell of oil mixed with coffee and sweat. A woman from the Red Cross moved among them with trays of donuts, her white cap bright against the gloom. Eric noticed how even exhaustion seemed organized, fatigue rationed like fuel. Later, as darkness fell, headlights stitched the horizon again. From above, it must have looked like a constellation migrating east, a man-made Milky Way of steel. Somewhere beyond the dark lay the Rhine, and beyond that Germany, his home, his shame, his unanswered question. He wondered what his mother would think if she saw this endless parade. These boys younger than his own recruits commanding the greatest fleet of trucks the world had ever known. He imagined her asking, "Why so many?" And he would answer, "Because they could." The power of the United States wasn't in the truck or the driver, but in the quiet certainty that if one failed, 10 more would follow. Redundancy had become invincibility. The Germans built masterpieces, machines meant to awe. The Americans built multiplicity, and machines meant to endure. One Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman, but 100 Shermans would still arrive. The same law now ruled the roads. Quantity had turned into a moral argument. At midnight, the convoy paused for refueling. Diesel drums hissed as pumps clanked. Somewhere down the line, a harmonica played a slow tune, half lullaby, half hymn. Eric sat on an ammo crate, watching silhouettes move through the mist, each man a gear in a system too vast to comprehend. He remembered the major's chalkboard again, the cartoon truck, the laughter. How small that arrogance looked now. These Americans had erased the boundaries between soldier and laborer, between heroism and scheduling. They fought with delivery receipts and won with deadlines met. When the column moved out, the ground itself trembled. Headlights swept across the hedges like waves. Eric felt the vibration rise through his boots, into his ribs, into memory. He thought of the Reich's map room, the colored pins shifting westward every week, commanders pretending the line still mattered. But out here on this living road, the pins were already obsolete. The map had been eaten mile by mile, drum by drum, until only motion remained. As dawn bled into gray, the convoy reached the Meuse. On the far bank, engineers were already building another bridge. One of them shouted, "By tonight, boys, this'll be a highway." Eric believed him. He looked east toward the invisible border of his homeland and realized something profound. The Americans weren't conquering territory. They were conquering distance. And distance once conquered never returns. By winter, the war no longer sounded like gunfire. It sounded like motion. Engines idling, cranes lifting, paper rustling in offices that stretched from Cherbourg to Antwerp. The Red Ball Express had turned Europe into an open factory where the product was victory and the raw material was will. Even prisoners like Eric felt it, that strange current of purpose humming beneath every order, every schedule, every dawn that began with the same 2 words, "Keep moving." In late November, he was transferred to a repair yard near Liège, a sprawling field of wrecked vehicles and men trying to make them live again. There he met Captain Lowry, a logistics officer with a grin as permanent as grease under his nails. Lowry spoke quickly, like a man racing his own thoughts. "See these engines, son? Each one's a promise. You fix it, some kid at the front eats hot rations instead of cold beans. That's how we win, not with miracles, with maintenance." He slapped the hood of a truck and laughed. "War's just a supply problem with explosions." Eric nodded, pretending not to understand the English, but he caught the rhythm. Optimism disguised as procedure. He had grown up in a nation where failure demanded punishment. Here it demanded redesign. When something broke, the Americans didn't curse it. They improved it. The yard became his classroom. He learned that every tool had a number, every bolt a replacement code, every delay a reason that could be measured and solved. No ideology. Just motion, correction, motion again. One afternoon, Lowry invited him to ride along a returning convoy. The trucks rolled through towns still scarred with shell craters. Yet in each square someone was rebuilding. Roof tiles stacked, children sweeping glass, cafes opening with cardboard signs reading, "Ouvert." The world was imitating the convoys. Keep moving, fix what you can, don't look back. Eric watched through the open window as a group of French villagers waved. An old woman crossed herself. A boy saluted. The sight stung him more than shame. It felt like forgiveness delivered by timetable. They stopped at a rest depot built inside a gutted railway station. American soldiers drank coffee beside captured Germans sorting mail. Someone had strung Christmas lights between the rafters, powered by a generator that chugged like an old hymn. On the wall, chalk marks tallied the trucks dispatched that day, 8742. Lowry tapped the number with pride. "Imagine that, friend. Back home they think this is chaos. But this is America. Order at 60 miles an hour." Eric smiled faintly. He understood now that their strength wasn't just abundance. It was belief in abundance. A faith that tomorrow would always bring more parts, more fuel, more chances. It wasn't arrogance. It was optimism made practical. They built systems because they believed people were worth supplying. That night, as snow began to fall, he shared a cigarette with a fellow prisoner named Otto. Through the fence, they watched the headlights snake along the highway. Otto said, "You ever think they're not delivering fuel? They're delivering the future." Eric didn't answer. He was thinking the same thing. Every truck that passed carried not just gasoline, but an idea that progress itself could be moral, that the machine, when guided by mercy, might redeem what ideology had destroyed. In his notebook, he wrote, "They do not fight despair with courage. They replace it with schedule." It was half sarcasm, half revelation. The next morning, Lowry found the note on the workbench, read it, and grinned. "Not bad, Kraut. You might make a decent American yet." By December, the convoys reached the Rhine. Bridges sprouted like steel ivy over the frozen river, each one named after a city still in ruins. The war's map was almost complete. But for Eric, the lesson had already ended. He realized that America's greatest engine wasn't the GMC truck or the Sherman tank. It was the human mind trained to improve rather than despair. An engine that ran on curiosity instead of fear. When he looked back toward the west, where the endless roads vanished into mist, he felt a strange calm. He had seen the future, and it had headlights. Months later, long after the guns had fallen silent, Eric stood on a dock in Bremerhaven watching American trucks roll off the ships one last time. Engines muted, missions complete. Their tires left dark prints on wet concrete, like signatures of a system that had rewritten war itself. He realized they hadn't just carried fuel. They'd carried an idea, that mercy, order, and motion could rebuild what hatred had broken. As the last truck disappeared into fog, he whispered, "They conquered the road, and in doing so, they conquered us." The sound of engines faded, but the lesson remained. Yet even as silence settled, the rhythm of those convoys stayed inside him, a pulse that no ceasefire could erase. The docks around him were quiet now, only the gulls calling above empty cranes. Yet sometimes the wind caught between the warehouses and turned into a low mechanical hum, and he would look up, half expecting headlights to bloom out of the mist. He knew it was impossible. But once you had lived beside a moving nation, stillness felt unnatural, like holding your breath for too long. The occupation brought new uniforms, new flags, new schedules. The Americans packed their depots with the same neat precision they had built them, then turned them over to German clerks wearing borrowed pens and nervous hope. Eric became one of them, a translator first, then an accountant, recording deliveries not of munitions but of wheat, flour, penicillin. The ledgers looked the same as before, but the cargoes had changed. Now they were rebuilding. Numbers had become a language of mercy. He sometimes thought of Captain Lowry, who had once joked that war was a supply problem with explosions. Perhaps peace was just the same problem without them. Trucks still came and went, painted now with the words Relief Mission or U.S. Army Civil Affairs. Children chased them through the streets, waving, laughing. To them, the convoys were not weapons but miracles on wheels, the sound of hunger retreating. One afternoon, while tallying crates of powdered milk, Eric caught himself humming the tune the American nurse had once sung in the field hospital. The memory rose like steam from a hidden spring. Her voice, the smell of diesel and disinfectant, the faint smile that had made him believe, for a heartbeat, that mercy could be engineered. He wrote the day's figures neatly, then paused and added a note in the margin. Order at 60 miles an hour, still the only order that works. Winter bled into spring. Across Germany, roads scarred by tank treads were resurfaced by men who had once fired on each other. The same highways that had carried war now carried bread. At night, Eric would walk the edges of these new-built lanes, listening to the echo of tires rolling towards cities that were learning to breathe again. The stars above seemed dimmer than the ones painted on American fenders, but they felt closer, more human. Sometimes he wondered what had driven those boys across a continent of ruin. Fear, duty, or the simple refusal to stop. Whatever it was, it had outlasted empire. He had seen courage in the trenches, fanaticism in the speeches, but he had never seen faith like that. A faith expressed in torque and timetable, in men who believed that motion itself could redeem a world. He began to see the pattern everywhere. in the rebuilding of bridges, in trains that ran on time, in ration cards turned into currency, a rhythm steady and relentless. The future, he decided, was not an explosion waiting to happen. It was a schedule waiting to be kept. Years later, when people asked him how the war had ended, he never spoke of battles or generals. He spoke of trucks, of roads that did not sleep, of the sound of engines that taught him what inevitability felt like. They conquered distance, he would say softly, and then they conquered despair. On his desk, he kept one relic from those days, a small metal data plate pried from the dashboard of a wrecked GMC. Its serial numbers were faded, the paint eaten by rust, but the stamped letters still read, "Keep 'em rolling." He would run his thumb over it sometimes, feeling the indentations like braille for the blind. Each mark was a lesson: maintenance over madness, precision over pride. The world moved on as worlds do. New wars came, smaller and more fragmented. Nations argued over ideologies again. But whenever the news showed a convoy, food trucks crossing a border, ambulances threading through rubble, Eric felt the old hum return. The same mercy moving on wheels, the same arithmetic of hope. In the last years of his life, when his hair had thinned to white and his hands trembled too much to hold a wrench, he would sit by the window of his small flat overlooking a modern autobahn. At dusk, the headlights would merge into twin rivers of light, endless and calm. Sometimes he pretended they were the same trucks still on the same journey, carrying the same promise eastward. The sound reached him as a faint vibration through the glass, and a memory made mechanical. He thought of the men who had driven those roads, most of them gone now, and of the strange gift they had left behind. Not victory, not conquest, but continuity. A belief that no road once built should ever end in despair. The lesson, he realized, had not been about America at all. It had been about motion, about the will to connect one place to another, one hunger to its answer. When he died decades later, the caretaker who cleared his room found only a few possessions: a notebook filled with neat columns of numbers, the tarnished data plate, and a folded paper tucked between the pages. On it, written in his careful hand, were the same words he had once whispered into the fog at Bremerhaven. They conquered the road, and in doing so, they conquered us. The caretaker, not understanding, looked out the window where the night traffic flowed, red taillights threading toward the horizon, and wondered what kind of road could conquer a man. If stories like this move you, where history breathes through engines, and courage is measured in motion, subscribe for more. Each piece I write follows the hidden machinery of human endurance, the quiet victories, the unnoticed hands that keep the world turning. Follow, share, or comment to keep these roads alive. Your support fuels the next story. One more mile, one more voice, one more light down the long highway of memory. Keep reading. Keep rolling. The past isn't over. It's still moving, and you're part of its convoy.